I had an idea to make better use of the space in my small workshop. I wanted to create a table that sits above my planer thicknesser, the Electra Beckum HC260. As usual, I wanted to build something entirely out of salvaged materials and stuff I had laying around the workshop. I started by drawing a rough 3D design in Sketchup. I began by drawing the planer itself. Now this planer has a piece of what I presume is the motor that sticks out at the bottom, so I'd need to cut a couple of pieces of wood for the body of the planer to sit on. Then I wanted a little enclosure where I could store the jointer bed, push blocks and other planer accessories, and the planer would sit on top. I could use the old wheelbase that the planer was sat on originally. I just need to add some pieces to the sides and the back. And that concludes the mobile element of the project, but there'd also be a static part, which would be a basic table that sits above the mobile part. The back of the table would need stretchers at the top and the bottom to make the table rigid and strong, and the sides would too. And then I'd need something at the front, possibly a piece of plywood or something cut to the shape of the planer. And all this would give me a table that was approximately 950mm high, 620mm deep and 820mm wide. So it was time to get started, and first I needed to get the planer and its stand off the wheelbase, which was quite tricky on my own as this thing is very heavy. Then I could dismantle the old side pieces on the wheelbase. And to make new side pieces, I'd use some pine bed slats from an old bed that I found dumped by some bins. I cut these to size on the miter saw and then simply screwed them to the sides and the back of the wheelbase. The next piece I wanted to make was the enclosure. I had a look through my sheets of plywood and melamine and found some white gloss kitchen doors left over from when I fitted my new kitchen earlier in the year, which were a good size to use to make the enclosure. So I first cut the pieces to size on the table saw and trimmed to length on the miter saw. I clamped the side pieces in place, and then I could add the top piece and drilled pilot holes and added drywall screws. These kitchen doors still had their cellophane on, so I peeled that off. Then I could cut a piece for the back panel to size, and I screwed this in place too. And then I could cut the blocks for the planer to sit on, so I measured underneath the planer to figure out what size they'd need to be. And I had a look through my offcuts to find a couple of pieces that I could cut to the right size. And I cut them on the miter saw. So the base of the planer would sit on these two blocks, but I had an idea of mounting a couple of other pieces to the top of the blocks, which would create a couple of lips to stop the planer from moving around from left to right. With that done, I could then unbolt the legs from the planer. I removed the first two legs and then slid the new wheelbase underneath it. Then I could tip it forward and take out the back legs too. The The blocks that the planer would sit on were not yet secured to the enclosure, so I could make adjustments to get it into the right position, and then I secured the blocks from underneath using a stubby screwdriver. That was the mobile piece completed. Now to build the table. I had some lengths of 2x2s and 3x2s left over from a recent shed build, which I plan on uploading some videos of soon, and I'd use these to make the legs for the table. I chopped the legs to length from the miter saw, and then I could make the stretchers. I used various offcuts and more pine bed slats for these. And I used a small square and a spirit level to keep everything good and straight. Next I cut some pieces of pine to create some cleats that would be attached to the stretchers to secure the worktop to the table frame. I drilled pilot holes in these and attached them to the stretchers ready for the worktop to be mounted. Then it was back to my pile of sheets to find a piece of worktop the right size. I had a couple of pieces that I put to one side to keep when I took out my old kitchen. I cut it to size on the table saw. Apologies for the poor camera angle here. And then I could attach the worktop to the cleats. I cut another offcut of pine to the length of the worktop just to make it a little bit deeper, but also to form a back lip which would stop things falling off the back of the table. I attached this with drywall screws again into the back of the worktop. I cleaned the top of this piece up with a hand plane and then rounded over the edges with a block plane. I used more scraps of pine just to trim up the melamine edges of the worktop. At this point the table was taking shape and I mounted my drill press and my grinder sander to the worktop using some coach bolts. Now I just needed to create a front stretcher piece to make the table stronger. I moved the table into its final home next to my workbench and then pushed the planer base underneath. I took some measurements and found an old piece of plywood that was big enough to use for this. I took a series of measurements and marked up the shape of the planer onto the plywood. Then I cut this shape out with the jigsaw. It seemed like a good fit, but I clamped it in place temporarily just to make sure that the planer would slide in and out okay, and it did. I gave the plywood a quick sanding and then I could glue and nail the plywood stretcher to the front legs with my brad nailer. And that was the stand completed. I'm really happy with this addition to the workshop as it gives me more worktop space and somewhere permanent to put my drill press and grinder. The only real downside to this setup is that when I use the jointer it is a bit low down, which isn't ideal operationally, but for me the pros definitely outweigh the cons. especially considering I don't use the jointer that regularly anyway, and I can always sit on a stool or something if I'm doing a lot of jointing.